Welcome to Trinity Corps, where we discuss identity and the meaningful experiences that have shaped us. The stories that you will hear are not so much about the things we have done and achieved, but the people and events that make us who we are. This project is produced by Andrew Esqueda and Betsy Swetenburg, supported and funded by the Fuller Youth Institute.
I'm Betsy. I worked at Trinity for the last 2 years and do a variety of things, but adult ministries and informal worship, young adult ministries, mission, all sorts of things. I grew up in North Carolina with my parents and 2 brothers. I went to Davidson College and then moved to Atlanta after that for seminary and have been pretty much in Atlanta ever since then. I worked at Columbia Seminary as director of admissions and financial aid before coming to Trinity. And I live here with my husband, Owen, and yeah.
Cool.
That's it.
I am Andrew Esqueda, and I'll be starting my 5th year here at Trinity, which is kind of crazy. But started out working with just youth, and now work with children and youth and families and all that. I am originally from San Diego. I am wholeheartly a West Coast boy. The way I talk often, and also in the way I dress. Yeah.
The problem with recording is that they can't see the image.
They can't see that, yeah. I went to Whitworth University in Spokane, Washington, and then went to Fuller Theological Seminary. Married to Megan, and we have Isaiah, who's a 6-year-old in kindergarten, and brand new little Desmond, who is, I hope I get this right. I don't even remember how old he is. He'll be 4 months tomorrow, I think. No, I'm wrong. My wife's gonna kill me. 3 months and some change tomorrow, but he's so fun and awesome. So that's me. And Betsy and I are gonna talk a little bit about ourselves and engage in honest conversation about our lives and who we are and the things that shape us and the things and the ways that our lives and our faiths have been shaped by our experiences.
Yeah, I think a lot of times people think you're a pastor, so either you have it all figured out or somehow the sun shined in a way that you didn't really stumble and fall. And I think both of us would say that's not true. And so we're excited to be honest about those things and talk about things that are maybe tangentially related to church, but mostly not, because we are, although now this is where we spend most of our time, it was not, I grew up going to church, Wednesday night suppers and Sundays, but my formation, a lot of it was happening outside of the church.
Yeah, I think it's important too that, that we don't have, stumbles or falls in our life experience, but that we still don't, right? Yeah. Like that's just not true. I say to the youth all the time, like, I'm supposed to be a professional Christian, but I have doubts and issues with faith and the church. Doesn't mean I don't love it or that I don't still express my faith. It just might be in different ways.
Yeah.
So tell me about a formational memory or experience that you had that has shaped you, that has shaped your worldview.
Yeah. I have a very vivid memory from my childhood when I think I was in 6th or 7th grade, but I grew up in a small college town, Davidson, so it was very people call it Mayberry. We would leave our door unlocked unless we were going on vacation. Just kids can kind of, we're like free range chickens just all over town. You can just let them go. And so it was a big sense of community, and that was really great. Like I knew all my neighbors and all the kids in town. And so we had a big backyard, and people would always come play in our backyard. And I remember, well, first of all, so I'd play outside with my brothers, and on our screen porch, we had a big, like cowbell, or this hanging iron bell my mom had mounted, and she would ring it when it was time for dinner. So everyone knew that the Lyles were eating dinner when the bell rang, and a lot of kids would come inside and they would come have dinner with our family. We were usually eating early. So then they would go back to their house for a second dinner. Or sometimes they would, see what we were having if they liked it more than what their parents were. Did you have a big table,
or did everyone just eat wherever?
No, we had a big table, and that was my grandfather. Actually, he was a pastor, and my grandmother was the quintessential pastor's wife, if you can imagine, like 1950s Southern homekeeper. And they had this table built that we then got, and it has leaves. It has 14 leaves. Oh my gosh. And it could stretch probably the entire length of our den, which is connected to a little breakfast area. And so, I just remember my mom's like, go get another leaf, and we'll expand the table. And we didn't have that many chairs. I remember like pulling in the formal dining chairs, or we would just get the table bigger. But my mom was like very adamant that we all ate around the same table, and no answering the phone and no TV. You had to have conversation, and you had to sit at the table till the last person was done, because it was just no one could eat alone. So even as our lives got busier and with sports practices and stuff, if we were eating in shifts, you had to find somebody else to come sit with you while you ate your dinner. But anyways, so we had just this big table. My mom she called our house the 5 loaves and 2 fish house, because she would just somehow make the food multiply. But the memory I have is a night that my mom actually called my brothers and I inside after we got home from school, and she said, tonight is just going to be our family for dinner, that like no friends. So, I guess I'm in 7th grade, and I think, oh my gosh, someone has cancer, or they're getting divorced. One of the two. Like, why would we not have everyone at the table with us? And so that memory just sticks out, because I can remember so clearly just not having people around. It turns out that my dad was leaving his job and starting his own company, which had been a dream of his, and so we were just celebrating that with just us. But it sticks out because it was so atypical for my household. So
is that the only reason it sticks out, or is it that's a massive shift when you're recognizing that all of a sudden one day it's only your family, when it's always been your extended, right? Like your extended community who's sitting at a table with you and sharing a meal.
Yeah, I think, I think now that I think about it, my parents wanted to give us space to like ask questions, and we were still, middle school and elementary school. So we were young. I remember my little brother, who was kind of anxious about things that he didn't need to be anxious about as a kid, but he was nonetheless. And I remember, when my dad said I quit my job before he could get the next part of his sentence out, my little brother said, are we going to live in a box? He just couldn't what does it mean for a parent not to work? And so I think that probably my parents in their wisdom recognized that that's a conversation we didn't need to have a lot of guests around the table for. But
and your big table couldn't fit in a box.
That's right. But I think that I mean, it stands out because my parents are both so welcoming. They still live that way, with just kind of an open door policy. Even when I go home now, I feel most at home when there are friends around the table, and that's very common. So it stands out because it just was such an anomaly in my childhood for my parents to say, we're shutting our door. Like, that was just not part of my experience.
Sure.
So.
How does, right, that's a lot of like communal eating, sharing, living, and like at dinner tables, you typically talk about fun stuff, sometimes serious stuff, sometimes sad stuff. And obviously you're doing that in a larger community with, 13 or however many like middle and high school and elementary age kids and maybe their parents. So how does that experience shape the way that maybe you live now or you wished you lived, or the way that you view community or table sharing?
Yeah. I think in some pretty big ways. I still think the best way to get to know people is around a meal. I think that there's something that happens when you gather around food and share food together. So I love that. I find that it's harder to create some of those moments of spontaneous gathering in a city this size, that in a town. I mean, literally, it was just a bell. It was not. There were no invitations. So it was just whoever kind of showed up or whoever happened to walk in during the course of dinner would just pull up a chair. So that doesn't really happen as much when people got to drive great distances.
Sure.
And so I do find myself yearning for that sometimes, but it's okay. I think that still my instinct, if I want to get to know somebody better, or if I want to get a diverse group of people together, it's like, okay, let's find a time that we can sit at a table and chat. And I mean, with young adult ministry, like that always happens around food.
Yeah.
And I think that that's such an easy way to welcome people. And so, like, when we do this Friendsgiving thing, and I love that people bring foods that are important to their family traditions, and that's so telling. That, like, you get to share about what you brought and why you brought it, if there's a story, and you always wind up learning something about people's families or their significant memories. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of joy there.
It seems like the tables can be kind of a great equalizer, where it doesn't matter your background, or maybe you're sharing your background or your history with the food that you bring. Everyone needs to eat, right, at some point or another, and so it becomes this safe place, even in the midst of, like, even if you're at a restaurant with a group of people, all of a sudden, if something feels safe by sitting across the table from someone and eating and talking.
Yeah. I will say, I think that there is a safety and communion that happens around a table like it can't elsewhere, but food is also, it's a very touchy subject for people.
Sure.
I think that chances are, if you're gathered around the table, there's somebody who has a conflicted relationship with food, or their feelings about food, and I think that that's something that, like, to me, makes me want to continue inviting people around the table, because I think we've got to help counter that.
Yeah.
I think this society is really hyper-focused on body image and what foods you can eat and can't eat. And so, and I say that because I've had that relationship too, and I can remember in middle school struggling with an eating disorder, and so my instinct was to not be at the table, like, how do I get away? And what that did in part was, I mean, it isolated me from a lot of relationships. It hurt more than just like the food in my body. It physically disconnected me from other people. And so I think when I think about that, it's like, it's about more than the food. Like, the food is a means to a human connection. And so we've got to find a way to bring people together where that shame doesn't have to accompany being at the table.
Yeah. So in your experience, in your memory, there's joy, right? There's also some pain, and
Yeah.
at the table itself, right, representatively, there's joy and pain that exists, and that you've experienced, it seems like personally, but also that it's important to acknowledge when we sit at the table with people that someone else may be feeling unwelcome at the table because of something like food, because of food.
Yeah. And I think my hope and it took me a long time to get there, but I think I realized what a point of connection food is. And so by gathering at the table, you hope that you open up some kind of community that can help you through the pain around food. So it's not like inviting someone to the table for a meal who struggles with food in any way. It's just going to solve it. But I do think that there are deep relationships and connections that can be formed, and hopefully can help you navigate until you feel like the table is a comfortable place again. But yeah, I remember, my personal story is one of anorexia, and so I would, just pick and then try to get to my room as fast as possible. And it took a long time to want to kind of join that community again.
So how do you like cut through or kind of subvert the shame that can happen? Like what are, like I remember other people who I have known who have had eating disorders. So like one of their biggest pet peeves is they sit down and someone says something like, and it's a moment of shame, like, oh, did you get enough food? Or like, I didn't see, like, that doesn't look like enough food to me. So how do we give people tools to not
or
experience?
the opposite side, which you see is, oh, you really want that?
Yeah.
Or, gosh, you're eating a lot, know. So I think I think for me, it's just recognizing that it's so personal. That's not something you comment on. Yeah. You hope that you trust people to feed their bodies whatever it is that they want. But I think that there are moments, I've had plenty of moments where, after the fact, I say, hey, I see something in you that reminds me of myself.
Sure.
Can I tell you about that? And for me, I've been able to open up further conversations and points of connection with people. But I think especially in American culture where we talk about obesity so much, that there's just judgment automatically associated with food choices. Like, oh, you really want to go through a drive-through? And we neglect a lot of things about food that, there are all sorts of biological things that impact our bodies. And, I know plenty of people who are very small who make horrible food choices if you want to judge based on a food pyramid, and plenty of other people who are spending a lot of time trying to figure out what the best way to fuel their bodies, and but you wouldn't necessarily see that by looking. So I think it's just such a fraught relationship, and culture impacts that. So the more that we can gather around food and not comment on people's choices, I think it's one tiny step in changing that. But
I think you said, food is something deeply personal. And I don't think it's a rarity that I hear people talking about, oh man, my food choices are really personal. Or maybe I have an eating disorder, or maybe I have food sensitivities or food allergies. And at the end of the day, when you're sitting around the table with people, all of a sudden you realize you're bringing something deeply personal to a communal experience. Mm-hmm. Maybe that reshapes the way we think about table communion and things like that. Yeah.
And there is nothing more Christian than sharing a meal.
Sure.
It is at the center of our faith, and so I think it's a shame when we forget that the table is meant to be a place of no judgment and joy. just in terms of human relationships and what you're eating and your conversations. And so I do think, as Christians, we have a particular responsibility to try to continue bringing people to the table, because communion is a symbol. But to do that work where people feel invited, it's going to take more than just having communion and worship. It's going to take practice at the table outside of worship. And I think that can be a deeply spiritual experience.
Yeah, so that's obviously shaped the way that you think about your faith and you think about your ministry too, then, right?
Yeah, I think my instinct is always to say, let's have a meal, or, oh, I want to get to know you. Okay, great. Like, come over for dinner. And so I think that there are things that I think it just opens up relationships in a new way. But I think for the church too, especially, the church is no less fraught with politics than the larger culture. And so I think that if people can get together around a meal and share who they are, then they risk knowing each other in a way that is much more profound than whatever they might assume about each other just from being in worship together on Sunday mornings.
Very cool. Thanks for sharing some of your story. And with me, obviously we know each other, right? But it's like, and by the way, Betsy and I didn't we talked about some of these questions, but this conversation just kind of evolved in us going back and forth, and as we're sitting at a table sharing coffee together.
I know, we just need some food.
We just need some food. That's right.
But I think we should have a big dinner. So this is everyone's dinner invitation. When we're done with the project, we'll have a big meal.
Sounds good to me. I'm always down for meals. It's funny, as you talk and share your story, as we have had many conversations before, it's amazing to me that when someone shares about your childhood and about your own experience, all of a sudden it triggers something in the person you're talking with about their childhood or their experience or my relationship with food, and hopefully whoever listens to this will have the same connection.
Yeah,
or insights.
What came up for you?
So one of the things that came up for me was I think that particularly around food, and I'm speaking to this as a male, so I want to acknowledge that oftentimes we see issues around food as a female thing. Only women have issues with food, which is just frankly untrue. And I personally, I'm a prime example of that. I spent much of my younger childhood a very chubby and insecure little boy. And I remember I would go to church camp, summer camp, whatever, and all the kids would take off their shirts and jump in the pool, and I wanted to keep my shirt on. Those are that's not we have to think, oh, that's a memory of the past, but that's I remember, I see myself as that little kid. And that continued into high school. Frankly, it's one of the reasons I got into wrestling was I felt I'm a bigger kid. I'm uncomfortable with my body. Maybe this will help me. Maybe it will help the way I look. Maybe I'll feel better about myself. Maybe I'll think, hey, I'm bigger, but I can do these things. And even through that period of time, right, that's the time too. So this is in the early 2000s, in which there's no cutting weight regulations for wrestlers, and we did crazy stuff to make weight, but we did crazy stuff to look good, and people don't want to acknowledge that. And it doesn't mean that we were not healthy. And nobody talks about wrestler or whatever sport or whatever non-sport you're in, whatever you do. People don't often talk about guys and food. And mainly they talk about how much food guys can eat, which is another issue in and of itself, right? Or just humans in general. And then I go into college, I'm lifting weights and get into bodybuilding, which is not about how much weight you can lift, but about how you look. And so, and even to this day, like those are the things that I struggle with. Like I have a complicated relationship with food, and it's hard to talk about that stuff. And not only is it hard to talk about, I think for many people, but even stepping into that conversation is somewhat taboo. Or a no, or no, like I'm not going to talk about that, right? Like I'll never forget at Montreat one summer with our youth, the speaker talked about her struggle with an eating disorder. And I remember making it clear and sharing some of my story and saying like, hey, this is not just a female thing. This is an everybody thing. People have complicated relationships with food. And for me personally, much of that just stems from how I viewed myself, or how I looked at myself from the eyes of other people, and not from, a human loved and created in the image of God for good things in this world. But even like looking at myself in the mirror, I remember seeing myself not as I was, but as I perceived everyone else to think that I was.
Yeah. Whether or not they'd even said that.
Whether or not they'd even said it, right?
Yeah.
I could make up all of this stuff,
Yeah.
and be like, hey, this is the way that I... And you know what the crazy part about it is, and I'm thinking about this as this conversation's unfolding, is I participated in a physique sport, bodybuilding, in which my body was being judged. So I stepped into the realm of the exact thing in which I was fighting against much of my life, which was being concerned with what other people thought about how I looked. That sounds kind of toxic to me.
Yeah. What ultimately made you decide to stop doing bodybuilding?
I love that sport. Like, there's so many things I do love about it. I still weight train, but it's pretty selfish sport. And it's not just the table that revolves around food. It's your entire life. It's weighing out your food, counting your macronutrients. It's what did I eat prior to training? Am I doing intra-workout stuff? What about after I train? Like, it's like, imagine having something to like measure out, cook, and eat every 2 to 3 hours of your like waking day. It's exhausting. And then all of a sudden, the worst parts about how you view yourself come out, because you become so much more important than anything else that exists around you. And the table no longer becomes something that's for fellowship and community, and bringing that like really personal self to the table. It becomes about you like sitting in isolation, right? It's the kid who, when your mom rang the bell, like sat down by themselves to eat, and nobody said, hey, you're going to eat with, like, make sure someone's there to eat with you, right? Yeah. Like that's that story.
It sounds like it's a mix of wanting control,
Sure.
but also needing that at the expense of everything else in your life.
Yeah. I think sometimes I tend to overfunction, and it's to the detriment of myself and other people. And that's an example of like overfunction, which is at the end of the day probably about, you're probably right, about control. Having control over your life or your experience, and not letting other people's lives and experience help shape your own. And I do think that it's kind of weird. I have a very like rational view of those experiences that I've had. And I know like the ins and outs of them. I know the positives and negatives, the joys and the pains. But it's weird how so often we just like go backwards into those things. Like, I know like that when I behave or I experience the world this way, or enter into an experience, that it's probably not the best for me, but for some reason I still do it. So
Yeah, I mean, for me, I remember getting to college and I felt like it was the first time I was working so hard to make good grades, but I was just surrounded by a lot of very smart people and it was humbling, and I didn't feel like I was going to make it. And so when it felt like everything was uncertain around me, then going back to food and like, if I can control this one piece of my life. Now, then of course I had to realize like that comes at the expense of everything else that you want to be doing during your college years. And but I do think it's natural for our bodies to want to find something that we can control and grasp it for dear life. So I think that's human. And it takes a lot of work to remember that sometimes what you're sacrificing is not, it's not worth it. It's like actually the things that are most important to you. Like in my case, I feel like, a lot of my friendships suffered, and, extracurriculars that I cared about, all of a sudden, like, I wasn't doing those, or I wasn't showing up to events with food. Ultimately, I could say those things are more important. It just didn't like feel it at the time. So
I like distinctly remember there were times, especially on Friday nights in college, when this is when I first started competing, where people would say, "Hey, do you want to hang out on Friday night?" And I wasn't even dieting at the time. This was just like prepping, and I'd be like, "Sorry, I got to work out first. Like, I'll meet you guys at like 9, but it's 7, and I got to go train."
yeah.
And sometimes I trained with a partner, and sometimes I trained all by myself. And training's great. Like, I love working out. It's like, it's cathartic, it's therapeutic, it's all of those things. But I do think you're right, when it's at the expense of community over an extended period of time, it's probably not healthy. Mm-hmm. And maybe it's in some sense it is it's an attack on our humanness. Right? Our humanness is not something about like perfection, but really sharing in other people's human experience, and faults and insecurities and joys and pains, and really personal things and really trivial things being brought to the table together. And whatever the table actually means for you too, right? It doesn't always just have to be sitting at the table at food, but the table, at least I think how I view it, is representative of being in community with one another and having other people's human experiences shape the way that you are.
Yeah.
Or you choose to be in the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's true. I think just hearing you talk about exercise too, which, obviously gets connected to food. I feel like, I don't know if there will ever not be some vanity side to exercise. Sure. I think that's just, part of it. But I also, I think there's this shift that happened for me where it was like less about, oh my gosh, here's how I need my body to look, which I quickly learned, like, it's never going to look that way, because there's always going to be something else. Or like, as soon as you get to this point or whatever, then it's like, oh my gosh, but this next thing or whatever. But I feel like now exercise is always, it's become so spiritual for me, because I just feel like, oh my gosh, my body can do this thing. Like, it's less about the end result, but more about like, holy cow, like, I was created and I am able to move in this way or to push myself in this way. And so I feel like more and more I just like take joy in what I'm able to do, and being able to move. And I feel like I'm always just pretty amazed and in gratitude for that. But that was a pretty significant shift for me.
Well, I think you're right. I think God cares about our bodies, right? Like, not just, historically this kind of like body soul dichotomy that is often spread throughout Western culture and the church, and but like God cares about our bodies, not like our actual physical bodies and how they exist. And I think you're right. There is something spiritual, like especially when your mind becomes really in tune with your body, and you're like, holy, I can do this stuff. I can. I think about that when I'm wrestling, and like wrestling straight another human for 6 minutes is the most exhausting thing I have ever done in my entire life. And I've done it a lot, which is just nuts, right? Like you don't think that you can do it, and then all of a sudden you can. And there's something human and empowering about that, and that does give you a really positive view of yourself. So there's like joy around food and exercise. There's pain around food and exercise, and then there's joy again. And it seems like this thing that goes back and forth and back and forth. And maybe that's just part of the human predicament.
Yeah, I think so. I think, there's no way to get around it. It's like something, when we're babies, we exist to eat. And you get praised for eating. Like, It's so important.
We say to Desmond all the time, like, good boy. Like, yeah, like, he's a big eater, right?
And you have to schedule your existence around his eating. And a lot of your well-being depends on his eating.
Yeah.
And then I don't know when it is that shifts, but it does.
Yeah.
And I think it's such a significant shift for humans. And just everyone probably has that baggage around them. So I think that it's just a matter of figuring out how to open up those conversations with people. Because everyone's got a story.
Sure. How do you, maybe it's just a question for both of us. How do you get around a sense of, right, whether it's struggles with food or depression or anxiety or whatever any individual or you are going through, how do you get around not seeing yourself or seeing those experiences as a sense of failure?
I guess part of my work has been not like trying to take failure out of my vocabulary. I tend to be a perfectionist, and so it's hard for me to think like, I mean, my instinct is always to say I failed at this, but I think it's more and more just about learning who I am as a person. So now I feel pretty confident to say, like, I know that my response to stress is going to be to go to this, not as extreme control of food as it has been in the past, but it certainly I'll seek more control around my food and my exercise than I normally do. And I think being able to name that, like, I can say to Owen, like, if you notice something, I need you to say, like, it's going to start happening before I can, like, rationally and logically say, oh, this is probably not healthy for me. And so being comfortable to name that that's just a part of who I am, and ask people who I really trust to hold me accountable and help bring me back. And I'd say Owen is he's just really great about checking in. And
Sure.
In part, I mean, he was with me all through college and beyond. So I think I've certainly given him a lot of practice, but he's pretty graceful about, just being able to open up those conversations in a way that's not accusatory or makes me think about, oh, I failed. More just like, what's causing me to act this way? And what do I need to do to get back to the version of myself I want to be?
Yeah.
So.
I think it's interesting you said take failure out of your vocabulary. I think I have a tendency to say, oh no, we should all have permission to fail. But the flip side of failure is achievement. And I think that's what our obsession is all of ours. Like on the Enneagram, I'm a 3. I'm an achiever. That's like, but we are this obsessed with achievement, and we can't fail. We can't exist in such a way. And if we got rid of failure out of our vocabulary, maybe we wouldn't be so obsessed with achieving things, and we be more obsessed with being and existing together and saying that what's most important right now is a sense of wholeness, which I think only comes when you have a really good community who actually cares about you and knows who you are more than the things that you have accomplished in your life.
Yeah, when you start taking away those achievements or whatever you perceive to be your greatest achievements, then what's left, and where do you find joy? I think that's important. I certainly struggle with that, and it's easier for me to say, like, in terms of exercise and eating, like, okay, take failure out of it. But I also think, I mean, it's harder for me to do professionally, and I think that it's easy for me to wrap up a lot of my personal identity in my professional identity. So yeah, that's a big struggle. But I also, it's like we need to rebrand failure. It's not I would agree and say, yeah, people need to be given room to fail, or just try without, it's like, how do you eliminate the shame that comes from having tried something? Or, and I don't know what the answer to that is, but I think we're desperate for that.
Sure.
And I saw something the other day that it's like, I was talking to a parent who said, my child's mental health and physical well-being is far more important than any college admissions letters.
Yeah.
And I think that maybe what we're seeing right now with this generation of kids who are plagued by anxiety and status aspirations and just needing achievements. I thought I was that way, but I think it's just gotten exponentially worse, in part because everyone can broadcast them out to a wide network, so you're always comparing your outtakes to everybody else's highlight reel. I think that maybe parents will start to shift and say, I hope at least, it's less about where you get admitted or having the perfect grades, but there is something to just being human, and it's okay. That, what can you do and still be healthy? And I think this is where the American culture is unhelpful, because you think you have to be the smartest person and get the best grades and then get a job where you're working crazy hours and you're supposed to call that joy. But I certainly have peers who say, I'd prefer my time over money. And so I'm going to choose a career that may not pay as well as other things, but at least I'll get time to enjoy. And that might be a larger shift.
Sure, I think where everyone's obsessed with the resume, right? Like my identity becomes what's down on my resume or what someone else has said about me, and not what are the things that make me tick. We don't ask people like, hey, we say, hey, how's your job going? Not, hey, how are you doing? Right? That's the very first thing that we often go to. Or the most popular question asked a stranger is, what do you do for a living? Or what do you do for work? Not, tell me about who you are. I think and we're seeing that publicly right now, Lori Loughlin and like all the stuff that's going on with the kind of college admissions scandal. And I think you're right. I think it's really important that we don't get I think we get engulfed by achievement and the things that we've been accepted to, or the goals, and in doing so we lose ourselves.
Yeah, I'm not going to go into this, except that I'm reading a great book right now by this modern philosopher, and it's called Status Anxiety, and it's tracing through our philosophies of what grants somebody status, and kind of that transition from hereditary status, of course, the royal lineage, to achievement status, and why we get so caught up with this and ways to maybe counteract it. But I would recommend it. It's a good book.
Yeah, I was just talking to a whole bunch of dads. We were talking about David Brooks' Second Mountain. First mountain is like happiness, goal, achievement, essentially. Second mountain is that really is about joy, and that joy is enduring. At the end of the day, it's a life in which you share the gifts that you have with other people. I think that's the place where most of us want to try and get, and we're kind of climbing the wrong mountain.
Yeah. Well, our instinct is to look out for ourselves.
Yeah.
But
Cool. Well, thanks for sharing your story with me.
yeah, and thanks for sharing some of your story too.
And we hope that our sharing of our stories together will really help to encourage other people to share their story and to share who they are, not just apart from what they do and the things that they've achieved, but the things that they're passionate about and their families and the things that make them move and exist in the world.
Yeah, and we can't wait to hear them.
All right. Thanks.
Thanks. Can't wait to see y'all for dinner.